We'll also see historic design in postmodernism, and I've touched on this already. The idea that postmodern architects will look back at previous styles and borrow from them in a whimsical and usually mixed fashion. In this case, we're looking at a structure where there's clear Egyptian influence, but it's sort of basic Egyptian influence. He's not going into the detail that you would expect from, for example, Egyptian revival, which we saw during the Victorian. Now, a lot of postmodern historic design will reject the Puritanism of modernism, and it will look for a return to ornament and an accumulation of citations and collages, and that's the important part. They're going to mix different styles and ideas. They might take something from the classical architectural styles. They might take something from neoclassical. They might take something from British arts and crafts. And they might do it all in one structure. The idea is to create something that is useful, artistic, and eclectic all at the same time. In our example here, this is, of course, the Sony building. And this is developed or designed by Philip Johnson with the appearance of a modern skyscraper, but then it has this Chippendale pediment on the top of it, something that really stands out as unusual, especially when surrounded by so many international style structures around it. So it gives it an air of whimsy. It makes it something that's slightly more inviting. So what you tend to see in these styles is they will mix ideas. Here we have a building that looks like it's just a bunch of building blocks that were kind of plugged together, but we get that sense of historical elements. For example, the obelisk here as our triangular form comes to a point, or we have the sphere and cap giving us, or sorry, not sphere, cylinder and cap giving us that sense of a classical column. Even though we know that it isn't, it still gives us that element. It sort of calls to us. So we have that Sony building that we've talked about, very straightforward. The masonry, of course, covering over the steel frame that we know is underneath it, and the Chippendale top that they've put on there. It looks like it could be a high boy. All it's missing is the front brake that we would expect from Chippendale. Or in France, we see the Palais des Abraxas. And this is actually a housing complex outside of Paris and was a social housing project designed to relieve congestion in the city. This complex has giant columns made of prefabricated concrete on the corners of the buildings, and a modern version of a triumphal arch was raised in the courtyard with 20 apartments within. A multi-story building formed into a representation of a Roman amphitheater. So we see something that's calling out different ideas, the Roman triumphal arch, but also, of course, the French Arc de Triomphe. That idea of the semicircular housing, which we've seen elsewhere. You would see it in Nazi Germany, you would see it in Victorian England, and the idea of this public housing with the massive columns on the corners, and then the windows creating the sense of columns running along the length. So they're calling back to these classical forms, even though we know that it's not specifically classical. They're mixing all of those ideas. And then, of course, sustainability and ecological ideas come into play because we have, for example, the green roof. We also see the same thing happening at the National Museum of Roman Art in Spain, where we see these thin Roman brick arches in a series that have the appearance of the understructure of the Roman Colosseum, this repetitive arch form. Now, they're not using it for structural reasons. It doesn't need to be there. Obviously, we have things like steel and other things that can be used for this construction, but it does give you a sense of exactly where you are and a certain historicity, especially in a museum of Roman art.